It's Friday, November 12th. My name's Juan Brown. You're watching the Blanco Lirio channel. And the other day, the NTSB published some important preliminary information regarding the MD-87 runway overrun in Houston, Texas that occurred last month. This video is going to dovetail in closely with my previous video on the MD-87 overrun event in Houston. Let's go through the details here from the NTSB. This accident, of course, occurred on October 19th of 2021, about 10 a.m. Central Daylight Time. The Boeing MD-87 November 987 Alpha Kilo, not former Alaska Airlines, but Alpha Kilo after the owner's name initials, operated by 987 Investments LLC, overran the departure end of runway 36 at Houston's Executive Airport, that's KTME, Brookshire, Texas, just outside of Houston, and the crew executed a rejected takeoff. Of the 23 passengers and crew on board the airplane, 2 passengers received serious injuries and 1 received minor injuries. A post-crash fire ensued and the airplane was destroyed. The airplane was operating as a 14 code of Federal Aviation FAR Part 91 flight from TME to Lawrence G. Hanscom Field, KBED, Boston, Massachusetts. Now, I thought an aircraft of this size would need to be operated under FAR Part 125. FAR Part 125, if I recall correctly, allows that any aircraft that can carry 20 or more passengers and a cargo payload greater than 6,000 pounds. In other words, if you're going to operate an airline-type aircraft for private use, you need to operate it under FAR Part 125, not Part 91. The point being is, this accident, this report sounds just like what happened to the Ameristar accident back in 2017. Why did this happen again? Does this operating of the aircraft under FAR Part 91 versus Part 125 represent a potential loophole in the FARs that possibly could have helped prevent this accident from happening in the first case? Before the flight, the first officer conducted a pre-flight of the airplane while the captain obtained the flight plan paperwork and weather. The airplane departed at approximately 10 Central Daylight Time from runway 36 at Houston. The captain was the pilot flying and the first officer was the pilot monitoring. A couple things about pre-flighting an MD-80. The tail of the MD-80 is 30 feet up in the air. As a first officer who's flown the MD-80 before, you cannot physically get up there and move the tail of an MD-80. You can't visually see much of what's going on with the tail of an MD-80 from 30 feet up in the air. When you pre-flight the controls, when you do your controls check on the MD-80, again, reference my previous video where we did a deep dive into the controls of how the controls work on the MD-80, you are moving controllable tabs. So even though the elevator may be jammed, when you move the controls in the cockpit with no load on the elevator, no wind aerodynamic load, the controls may feel free and clear when they are in fact not, when the elevator is in fact jammed, because the control tabs are still operational. Remember, the MD-80 is a control tab flown aircraft. And those of you that say this is a ridiculous design, it never should have happened, well, you haven't spent a lot of time in the aerospace industry. This aircraft was designed in the 60s, and at the time that was the state of the industry. It was very common for these large transport aircraft to have tab-driven or tab-flown controls on the aircraft. It was a great, simple, redundant design that worked for many, many years. As one of you mentioned, these designs do have an Achilles heel that you got to be aware of, but that's where Part 121 maintainers did such a good job of maintaining these aircraft in the airline industry, why we very rarely ever had a problem like this in the MD-80 fleet in the airlines. According to flight crew interviews, during the takeoff roll, the first officer made the 80-knot V1 and VR callouts. V1, your takeoff decision speed. VR, your rotate speed, that time at which you pull back on the stick and rotate the aircraft up into a flying attitude. At the rotate callout, the captain tried to pull back on the control column, but indicated that it felt as if it were in concrete. About the time the first officer made the V2 call out, the captain informed the first officer of the problem. So V2 well beyond V1 takeoff decision speed. They're going fast. The first officer also attempted to pull back on the control column but was unable to pull it aft. The first officer called abort and retarded the thrust levers. Normally you're supposed to transfer the aircraft control and the captain do the reject, but in this case it's a very dire emergency. They're running out of runway. So the first officer initiated the reject. The captain deployed the thrust reversers. The captain indicated that the auto brake system was in rejected takeoff mode, RTO mode, and it applied maximum wheel braking. So before you take off, you set the auto brakes to RTO, rejected takeoff, and it will, when it senses a rejected takeoff, you're ripping the throttles back, it'll apply full maximum braking for you to help you get the aircraft stopped. But of course, this time they're going much too fast on a short runway. The airplane overran the end of the runway, went through the airport's perimeter fence, through power lines, and came to a rest in a field adjacent to the airport about 1,400 feet from the end of the runway. The captain commanded the first officer to get out, and the first officer exited the flight deck to assist with the passenger evacuation. The flight crew indicated that they confirmed that all passengers were off the airplane before they exited the airplane. So good job, crew, getting everybody safely off of this aircraft. This is a very bad situation that you are exposed to, and the crew did the only prudent thing they possibly could do, and by rejecting the takeoff versus trying to take this thing into the air, they saved everybody's life. Wreckage examination. The airplane came to rest about 1,400 feet from the end of the runway on a heading of about 235. No parts of the aircraft were found on the runway prior to the airport perimeter fence. Pieces of the airplane were found in the field between the perimeter fence and the main wreckage. Initial examination of the airplane by investigators found that the airplane structure forward of the empennage was heavily damaged due to the post-crash fire that ensued after the airplane came to a rest. That's where the tail of the aircraft just simply fell to the ground once the rest of the aircraft burned, which might help explain why the thrust reversers did not get ripped off in the runway excursion. All of the upper fuselage structure except a small section of the upper nose structure and empennage were consumed by fire. Both engines remained attached to their respective engine mounts, which were still connected to the empennage of the airplane and were in their normal orientation. There was no evidence of uncontainment. That means there was no evidence of an uncontained engine failure. And both thrust reversers were intact and in their fully closed position. An exhaust pattern of burned earth and singed grass approximately 90 feet long was observed behind the exhaust duct of the right-hand number 2 engine, consistent with engine operation while stationary after the airplane came to a rest. And we talked about that in the first series of videos. The left-hand engine displayed, there was no burn pattern behind the number 1 engine, only behind the number 2 engine, which led a lot of us to think that, was there a problem with the number 1 engine and that white puff of smoke on takeoff? Is that what caused this whole cascading event? No, check this out. The left-hand number 1 engine displayed no stationary exhaust pattern on the ground. However, on-site examination revealed that the fuel control unit, the FCU, mounting flange to the high-pressure fuel pump was fractured and the surfaces displayed overload features. Additionally, the FCU housing exhibited overload fractures near the fuel metering valve housing cavity. In other words, the fuel control unit to the number 1 engine broke off while they were going to the rodeo off the end of the runway. And so the number 1 engine subsequently failed after they started going through the dirt and across the road and tearing up the airplane. The airplane is a T-tail design, such that the elevators and horizontal stabilizer are attached near the top of the vertical stabilizer about 30 feet above the ground level. The left and right elevators are attached by hinges to the rear spar of the horizontal stabilizer, and each was equipped with a control, geared, and anti-float tabs attached to the trailing edge. Here's the picture of it. Each elevator can travel between 27 degrees of trailing edge up and 16.5 degrees of trailing edge down between mechanical stops mounted on the horizontal stabilizer. A stop arm on each elevator contacts the mechanical stops to limit elevator travel, and a torsion bar distributes the increasing loading. And we've talked about this extensively in the previous video of how this tail system works. When the airplane is parked, each elevator is free to move independently within the confines of its mechanical stops if acted upon by an external force, such as wind, or by manipulation by ground personnel that should be pre-flighting these things. The elevator system by design has no gust lock, and the elevators are not interconnected. In other words, the elevators can split like this if they're moved by the wind or by, when I say ground personnel, I mean maintenance personnel should be up there inspecting these things after any kind of a wind event and before flight. This is not the pilot's job. The pilot can't get up there and physically do that like we're used to on our small aircraft. This is a maintenance function. Initial examination of the elevator control system by investigators found that most of the system's components forward of the engines had been consumed by the post-crash fire. Therefore, full control continuity could not be established. However, the airplane's empennage tail section was not consumed by the post-crash fire, and both the left and right elevators were found in the trailing edge down position. In other words, nose down position. Using a lift to access the elevators, investigators found, drumroll, that the airplane's left and right elevators were jammed in a trailing edge down position and could not be moved when manipulated by hand. That's why when you check the controls on the ground, they may feel free and clear on the ground while you're taxiing out, but as soon as you start applying an aerodynamic load to that elevator, V1 rotate, that's when the controls feel like they're stuck in concrete, because you got that elevator down force you're trying to overcome with the control tab, and it's not moving, forcing the late reject. Both inboard actuating cranks for both elevators' geared tabs, the middle tab, were bent outboard, and the respective links were bent. Here's the figure 5. Further, both actuating cranks and links were found locked in an over-center position beyond their normal range of travel. The elevator's horizontal stabilizer and control tabs have been retained by the NTSB for further examination. So just like what we demonstrated in the previous video with the Ameristar flight, is the same thing that happened to this aircraft. Why did it happen again? Flight recorders were recovered. There was basically nothing of import on those flight data recorders. Everything was ops normal right up until the reject point. Preliminary data from the airplane's flight data recorders, FDRs, showed that both elevators were positioned at approximately 18 to 19 degrees trailing edge down when the flight crew applied power and remained there during taxi. Upon reaching rotation speed, the recorded elevator position split, which they can do on the MD-80, but neither moved to a trailing edge up position. The aircraft reached a maximum speed of about 158 knots before decelerating. The operating parameters appeared normal on both engines and matched throughout the recording. So good job by the crew to catch this at only 158 knots. So why did this happen again? And that's going to be the focus of this investigation, I hope, going forward. Now, to be fair, there's not a whole lot of MD-80s, DC-9s left in the fleet here in the United States. However, there are a few still in private hands, a few in charter operations, and a few still being operated around the world, so it's important that this information get figured out. But I want to know why this was operated under Part 91 when it seems to me it should have been operated under FAR Part 125. It'll be interesting to see if this comes up in the investigation as well. Thanks so much for your support of this channel, especially over on Patreon, that make this content possible. This video again goes together with the previous couple of videos on this incident. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you here. Coming up next, 5G interference and the effects on autolands and radar altimeters specifically, coming up early next week. See you here.